Chapter 5 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Back on this side of the door. Because the game of hide-and-seek was still going on, it took Edmund and Lucy some time to find the others. But when at last they were all together, which happened in a long room where the suit of armor was, Lucy burst out. "Peter, Susan, it's all true. Edmund has seen it too. There is a country you can get to through the wardrobe. Edmund and I both got in. We met one another in there, in the woods. Go on, Edmund, tell them all about it." "What's all this about, Ed?" said Peter. And now we come up to one of the nastiest things in this story. Up to that moment, Edmund had been feeling sick and sulky and annoyed with Lucy for being right, but he hadn't made up his mind on what to do. When Peter suddenly asked him the question, he decided all at once to do the meanest and most spiteful thing he could think of. He decided to let Lucy down. "Tell us, Ed," said Susan, and Edmund gave a very superior look as if he were far older than Lucy. There was really only a few years difference. And then a little laugh, and he said, "Oh, yes, Lucy, I've been pretending that this story about the country and the wardrobe is true, just for fun, of course, but there's nothing there, really." Poor Lucy gave Edmund one look and rushed out of the room. Edmund, who was becoming a nastier person every minute, thought that he had scored a great success and went on to say, "There she goes again. What's the matter with her? That's the worst of young kids. They're always—" "Look here," said Peter, turning on him savagely. "Shush! You've been perfectly beastly to Lou ever since she started this nonsense about the wardrobe, and now you go playing games with her about it and setting her off again. I think you did this out of spite." "But it's nonsense," said Edmund, very taken back. "Of course it's nonsense," said Peter. "That's the point. Lou was perfectly all right when we left home, but since we've been down here, she seems to either be going crazy in the head or turning to the most frightful liar. But whichever it is, what do you think you'll do by being rude and nagging her on and encouraging her the next day?" "I thought and thought," said Edmund, but he couldn't think of anything to say. "You didn't think of anything at all," said Peter. "It's just spite. You've always liked being rude to anyone smaller than yourself, and we've seen that at school before now." "Do stop it," said Susan. "It won't make things any better to have a row between the two of you. Let's just go find Lucy." It was not surprising when they found Lucy a good deal later. Everyone could see that she had been crying. Nothing they could say made any difference. She stuck to her story, and she said, "I don't care what you think. I don't care what you say. You can tell the professor, or you can write to Mother, or you can do anything you'd like. I know that I met a fawn in there, and I wish that I'd stayed there, 'cause you are all beasts. Beasts, I tell you." It was the unpleasant evening. Lucy was miserable, and Edmund was beginning to feel that his plan wasn't working as well as he had expected. The two older ones were really beginning to think that Lucy was out of her mind. They stood in the passage talking about it in long whispers after she'd gone to bed. The result was, the next morning they decided that they would go and tell the whole thing to the professor. "He'll write to Father if he thinks there's really something wrong with Lou," said Peter. "This is getting beyond us." So they went and knocked on the study door, and the professor said, "Come in," and got up and found chairs for them, and he was quite at their disposal. When he sat listening to them with the tips of his fingers pressed among and never interrupting till they finished their story. After their story, he said nothing for a long time. Then he cleared his throat and he said the last thing either of them expected. "How do you know," he asked, "that your sister's story is not true?" "Oh, but—" began Susan, and then she stopped. Anyone could see from the old man's face that he was serious. Then Susan pulled herself together. "But Edmund said that they'd been pretending." "That's the point," said the professor, "which certainly deserves consideration. Very careful consideration. For instance, if you'll excuse me for asking the question, does your experience lead you to regard your brother or your sister as more reliable? I mean, which one is more truthful?" "That's just the funny thing about it, sir," said Peter. "Up till now, I've said Lucy every time. She's the most truthful." "And what do you think, my dear?" said the professor, turning to Susan. "Well," said Susan, "in general, I would say the same as Peter. But this couldn't be true, about all this woods and fawn stuff." "That is more than I know," said the professor. "And a charge of lying against someone whom you've always found truthful is a very serious thing. A very serious thing indeed. We were afraid that it mightn't be lying, said Susan. We thought that maybe something was wrong with Lucy. Madness, you mean, said the professor quite calmly. Oh, you make your minds easy about that. Only one has to look at her and talk to her and know that she's not mad. But then, said Susan, and stopped. She never dreamed that a grown-up would talk like the professor, and she didn't know what to think. Logic, said the professor, half to himself. Why don't they teach logic at school these days? There are only 3 possibilities. Either your sister is telling lies, she is mad, or she's telling the truth. You know she doesn't tell lies, and it's obvious that she's not mad. For the moment then, unless further evidence turns up, we must assume that she's telling the truth. Susan looked at him very hard and was quite sure from the expression on his face that he was not making fun of them. But how could this be true, sir? Said Peter. Why do you say that? Asked the professor. Well, for one thing, said Peter, if it was real, why doesn't everyone find the country every time they go in the wardrobe? I mean, there was nothing there when we looked, and even Lucy didn't pretend that there was something there. What's that got to do with it? Said the professor. Well, sir, if things are real, then they're there all the time. Are they? Said the professor. Peter didn't know what to say. But there was no time, said Lucy. Lucy had no time. She hadn't gone anywhere. Even if there was such a place, she came running after us the very moment we were out of the room. It was less than a minute, and she pretended she had been gone for hours. That's the very thing that makes her story so likely to be true, said the professor. If there really is a door in this house that leads to another world, and I should warn you that this is a very strange house, and I know little about it, but if there was a door that led to the other world, and I say she got into the other world, I wouldn't be surprised at all to find out that the other world had a separate time of its own, so that however long you stayed in there, it would never take up any of our time. On the other hand, I don't think many girls her age would invent that idea for themselves. If she was pretending, she would have hidden for a reasonable time before coming out and telling her story. But what do you mean, sir? Said Peter. That there could be other worlds all over the place, just around the corner like that? Nothing's more probable, said the professor, taking off his glasses and beginning to polish them while he muttered to himself. I do wonder what they teach these kids in school. But what are we supposed to do? Said Susan. She felt that this conversation was beginning to get off the point. My dear young lady, said the professor, suddenly looking up with a very sharp expression at both of them. There is one plan in which no one has yet suggested and which is well worth trying. What's that? Said Susan. We might all try minding our own business, he said, and that was the end of the conversation. After this, things were a good deal better for Lucy. Peter saw it that Edmund had stopped making fun of her and being rude, and neither she nor anyone else felt inclined to talk about the wardrobe at all. It had become a rather alarming subject. And so then, for a long time, it looked as if the adventures were coming to an end. But that was not to be. The house of the professors, which even he knew so little about, was old and famous. The people from all over England used to come and ask permission to see all over it. It was the sort of house that is mentioned in guidebooks and even in history. And well, it might be, for all the manner of stories that were told about, some of the stranger ones that I'm telling you now. And when parties of sightseers came and asked to see the house, the professor always gave them permission, and Miss Macready, the housekeeper, showed them around, telling them about the pictures, the armor, the rare books in the library. Mr. Macready was not very fond of the children. She didn't like to be interrupted when she was telling visitors all the things she knew. She had said to Susan and Peter almost on the first morning, along with many other instructions, "Please remember, you are to keep out of the way whenever I'm taking a party over the house." Just as if any of us would want to waste half the morning trailing around with a crowd of strange grown-ups, said Edmund, and the other 3 thought the same. This is how the adventures began for the second time. A few mornings later, Peter and Edmund were looking in the suit of armor and wondering if they could take it to bits when the 2 girls rushed into the room. "Look out! Here comes Mrs. Macready, and the whole gang is with her." "Sharp's the word," said Peter, and all 4 made through the door to the far end of the room. But when they got into the green room and beyond it and into the library, they suddenly heard voices ahead of them and realized that Mrs. Macready must be bringing her party of sightseers up the back stairs instead of the front stairs as they had thought. After that, whether it was that they lost their heads or that Mrs. Macready was trying to catch them or some kind of magic in the house came to life and it was chasing them into Narnia, They found themselves followed everywhere, until at last Susan, oh, bother those trippers. Here, let's just get into this wardrobe until they've passed. No one will follow us in there. But the moment they were inside, they heard voices in the passage, and then someone fumbled at the door, and then they saw the handle turning. "Quick!" said Peter. "There's nowhere else," and flung open the wardrobe. All four of them bundled inside of it and sat there, panting in the dark. Peter held the door closed, but it did not shut it, for of course he remembered of every sensible person that you should never shut yourself in a wardrobe. That's the end of chapter 5. So what do we think's going to happen? They're all piled in the wardrobe, hiding from Mrs. McCready and the sightseers. So what's going to happen?